Hey there! In this video, I wanted to share the top tips I have for indie game devs, so whether you are a full-time indie dev or just programming games as a hobby, these are my tips to you in no particular order. The first and possibly most important tip is learning how to finish a game. This is a skill that many indie devs, including me, struggle with, and it's really hard to learn because you constantly want to try out something new, work on something fresh. One piece of advice I found pretty useful is creating smaller projects, but taking them all the way to the finish line. These projects don't have to be masterpieces, you can just dedicate a couple of weeks to them. However, make sure they are complete, playable games with tutorials, menus, sound effects, and things like that. Gradually building bigger and more complex video games using this method will help you with staying on track. This advice ties into my next tip, which is not to overscope. Now I know that it can be tempting to implement new and interesting features, but please try to avoid these unless they truly improve the gameplay experience. Keep in mind that each new feature needs to be polished, possibly needs new visual and or sound effects, and also needs to be balanced, which means that each new feature increases development time exponentially. Also, overscoping can easily be avoided if you plan out your game properly, which would be my next tip. Creating a plan before starting work on a game is one of the best ways to make sure that you will be working as efficiently as possible. Also, alongside planning, you should try to create prototypes to see which ideas work and which don't. Unfortunately, I still struggle with prototyping since, if I start working on a game, it might as well be a full project, right? But this is not the right approach. You've probably heard this advice from other indie devs as well, but just throw together a couple of smaller projects and see what sticks. My next piece of advice would be to make your game unique. Now, this might seem obvious, but still. As an indie dev, you probably don't have the resources available to a AAA company. Therefore, making a basic shooter probably wouldn't work, since those big companies have already done it. Instead, you can try a couple of different things. You can try to blend genres, or you could even take a genre and flip it on its head. You could also try to create a unique mechanic in your game that fundamentally changes the way you play. A good example would be the dash in Celeste. This is my favorite approach. Now this next tip is related to the previous one, which is to make your game marketable. What I mean by this is to have a simple but unique concept that can easily be explained in one sentence. For example, a platformer where you fight an evil AI, or a survival game where you can build anything. Yes, I know Minecraft isn't technically an indie game anymore, but it was one when its development started. Gameplay is usually regarded as the most important element in a game. However, I feel like the role of visuals and sound effects shouldn't be understated. Don't get me wrong, you don't need hyper-realistic graphics. You can achieve great results with some simple shapes and colors. Again, look at Will You Snail. However, the art style should still be pleasing to look at. A simple way you can achieve this is to pick a nice color scheme. There are many great websites which do just that. Regarding sound, you could either record sound effects at home, or you could use the many tools available that help you with creating these effects, such as BFXR. You could also download free sound effects from the internet. Zapsplat is a great website for this. My next tip is still related to visuals, which is to pay attention to UI. I think nearly every game dev hates designing UI, and I understand it's pretty annoying. However, if you think about it, when people launch the game, the first thing they see is usually the menu. And first impressions, of course, matter. While playing a game, the scenery often changes, however, the UI usually always stays on screen, therefore it's important to design a UI that's pleasing to look at. This next tip is related to the development process itself, which is to spend time cleaning up and optimizing your code. I understand that when you are working on something, it's much easier to quickly throw together some sort of code and then call it at that, but speaking from experience here, this has some pretty bad consequences down the road. If you just spend a couple of minutes thinking about how that code should be written, it'll be much easier down the line, trust me. My next advice is related to studying and learning how to code, and that would be to watch tutorials. This might seem obvious, but there is a correct way to do it. Instead of just copying what the tutor is doing, actually try to understand why they are doing that and how the code they are writing works. One tactic that worked for me is just pausing the tutorial and trying to figure out how the tutor would code the next step. This way, you'll actually learn how the code works instead of just typing letters. The final tip for today's video is to not be afraid to use assets. Assets are a great way to implement things into your game in areas you aren't that experienced in. There are many great assets available, both free and paid. One thing you should be careful about, however, is picking the right assets. One of the worst things you could do is making your game look like an asset flip, that is a game with thrown together assets that do not look coherent at all. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, then please like and subscribe, and if you want to see more videos like this, consider supporting me on Patreon, link is in the description. Goodbye and take care.